My name is Erin Dady. I'm a planner and a lawyer based in West Palm Beach. My clients are local governments predominantly. And one of the questions that I've been getting over the last year is how do we take the data and information that Jennifer and Sam have been talking about this morning, and how do we integrate that into our long-term planning strategies? So there's pretty much not a week that goes by when I don't get a call from somebody saying, how do I do this, and what are the requirements for me doing this? So I'm going to talk a little bit about what local governments are doing. In the past, in 2010, when we had House Bill 697, it amended certain elements of our growth management law, Chapter 163, and that's when we started to see strategies about greenhouse gas emissions and climate change kind of entering into our comprehensive planning process. What I'm going to talk about are the more recent examples. Adaptation action areas, which came into the law in 2011, and then most recently the Peril of Flood Bill, Senate Bill 1094, which amends sections of Chapter 163 related to the preparation of coastal elements for comprehensive plans. About a year ago, I co-authored an article with Thomas Rupert. It's in the Environmental and Land Use Law Section Reporter that kind of talks about some of the implications of Senate Bill 1094, but it was early. It was right after it passed. And now a couple of months later, we're doing research on trying to figure out on how certain local governments are complying with that rule of law and what that actually looks like in terms of comprehensive plan language. So our research is largely based on what the Department of Economic Opportunity has seen so far in speaking with local governments. I know certain local governments are in the process of addressing these changes, like I know the city of Boynton Beach, the city of West Palm Beach, and some other local governments are looking at how they integrate these components into their comprehensive plans currently. And where the rubber meets the road on this are your goals, objectives, and policies, and your data and analysis in your comp plan to support those goals, objectives, and policies. So what does the legislation actually do? It does a lot of things. It deals with insurance implications, elevation certificates, but the most important part that I'm going to concentrate on are these development and redevelopment principles, strategies, and solutions. And what does that look like? Essentially, what DEO is looking for and what the legislation says is that from now on, for the first time, you will address what I call future flood risk. From surge, from sea level rise. It's the first time that you will see a requirement that we are adopting some level of language within our comprehensive plans related to sea level rise, best practices to remove property from future harm, site development techniques, obviously consistency with the Florida Building Code and our coastal construction control line provisions within Chapter 161. And then this is the first time we're also seeing a tie-in to the National Flood Insurance Program's community rating system and how to encourage local governments to participate in that. And the synergy with this is if you line up and get great policies in your goals, objectives, and policies in your comp plan, you could possibly gain points within the CRS program. So having an integrated strategy to deal with future flood risk is a win-win situation. So I'm going to talk about where we are with local governments and provide some local government case studies on who's complying, the types of language that they're actually adopting into their comprehensive plans. And again, this can only capture notifications and correspondence to DEO that we've been able to find so far. This may not reflect where everybody is in the process. But we have eight local governments that are mentioning adaptation action areas in their comprehensive plans. 2 have physical designations. I know the city of Fort Lauderdale has been doing a lot of work on this also. But in terms of actual comp plan language, that's what we've been able to uncover so far. This is codified in the coastal management element section. It doesn't prevent a local government from going further. For instance, some local governments are adopting new separate elements of their comprehensive plan. I know Broward County has a separate element. Monroe County has a separate element. I think Coral Gables does also. So none of this legislation is prohibitive in terms of how far you want to go with integrating these issues into your comp plan. Typically, what we're seeing so far is that local governments are not waking up and saying, hey, today's Thursday, I've decided today's the day I'm going to comply with Senate Bill 1094. What they're essentially saying is when they're going in for their next kind of overhaul of their comprehensive plan, letting DEO know that they're going to do some type of amendment to their comprehensive plan, that's when they're indicating, it's time to update our comp plan based on new and existing law. Therefore, we'll probably look at Senate Bill 1094 in that context. So far, 9 local governments have sent evaluation letters to DEO saying we are going to do some major amendments. Now, this is only since November 2015. So we're trying to capture data after Senate Bill 1094 was enacted. So there may be local governments that have this stuff in their comprehensive plans prior to that. So our research is only going back a short period of time after implementation of the bill. And 4 of those local governments have said, look, no changes are necessary to our comprehensive plan. And some of those local governments have actually already identified sea level rise as an issue and included it as a goal, objective, or policy on some level within their comprehensive plans. So that's kind of like the current state of affairs. I'm going to get into some specific examples. And DEO has also made some determinations with certain comprehensive plans. Again, Broward and Monroe are good examples where they have separate elements of their comprehensive plan. And DEO has essentially said most recently, look, you don't need to go back and revamp. We don't see any inconsistencies here. And then we've got others that we know are in the process right now that have said that they want to address this issue on some level, so they're in some level of negotiation. And I know I spoke to Boynton Beach within the last couple of days, and they are in that process also, researching and trying to figure out exactly how they want to incorporate these elements into comp plan amendments and updates as well. So, how do these requirements affect planning? So, if you want to address sea level rise and future flood risk within your comprehensive plan, what are some of the issues and how would you potentially go about doing it? And I kind of categorize these as short-term, mid-term, and long-term strategies. Short-term being that you have to figure out what your compliance strategy is with Senate Bill 1094. And what the language says in the law is you have to come up with development and redevelopment strategies. So what is that going to apply to? Is it going to apply to private development, infrastructure, natural resource protection? How do you define what that looks like? And how do you define how you're going to start addressing short-term capital improvements projects while integrating kind of this new information and data? In the midterm, as your comp plans are coming up for potential amendment, you may look at incorporating more goals, objectives, and policies to deal with that new language. And then in the long term, probably what we'll see local governments starting to do is say, hey, within a certain amount of time of adoption of our comprehensive plan, now we're going to look at our land development regulations. How are we going to influence the physical environment of our planning decisions based on this data? I want to digress just a minute. Nancy is handing out a survey that was developed. DEO is looking for the types of information that we are discussing in this presentation to try to get a handle on where local governments are in the process and what would assist them in potentially complying with some of these new requirements or addressing sea level rise or flood risk within their comprehensive plan. So it's really important to get that feedback to DEO. Our research, we're kind of making a commitment that we're going to research this and update our list of who's in compliance every 6 months, and we'll try to work with the compact to potentially publish that data. But this survey is actually really important for DEO to kind of track these issues also. So this would be kind of your bookends in terms of short-term and long-term strategies to potentially integrate sea level rise and storm surge within your comprehensive plans. And what might that look like? Well, we've talked a lot this morning so far about data collection. How are you going to develop these strategies if you don't even know where you're vulnerable yet? That might also look like some type of vulnerability analysis where you find out where and how much of your land is potentially impacted. And then finally looking at changing regulations within the physical environment to promote better development patterns. The legislation does not require a compliance timeline. Like I said, people are just coming in when they're amending their comprehensive plans and saying, oh, now it's probably time to address these new requirements. There's no specific review criteria because we don't have that criteria rule anymore that some of us know about, 9J5. That's been all integrated into 163. So there's no specific method on what you have to put in your comp plan to comply with this new legislation. And we have a couple of case studies, but again, it's early. It's very early. There are only a few local governments that have come in and dealt with the process. So the red stars kind of indicate where some local governments are starting to say, hey, it's time to amend our comprehensive plans. Some are flagging Senate Bill 1094 as a compliance issue. Some are not. And then typically what the responses are, these are kind of like the local governments that we have in the process right now or that have recently gone through an amendment process. And then some mentioned changes that were necessary to their coastal management element consistent with the 1094 language, and some have not. Monroe County is a very recent example. They were determined to be in compliance in June. They have a couple of references to sea level rise and storm surge within the coastal management element of their comprehensive plan, but they took the same type of approach that Broward County did, where they said, we're going to put this stuff in a new element of our comprehensive plan. So again, it's not like DEO is going to turn around and say, that's a bad idea, we want you to put it all in the coastal management element. It's leaving some level of discretion up to the local governments as to how they want to integrate this stuff into their comprehensive plan. So they had no comments back from DEO on their approach with what I would call kind of a hybrid, somewhat addressing it within the coastal management element and then somewhat addressing it within an entirely new element of their comprehensive plan. So 2 instances of managing or mentioning sea level rise within the coastal management element and then the separate element. Jupiter Inlet Colony initially identified that they were not going to be doing any amendments to their comprehensive plan. There was no mention of sea level rise in their existing comprehensive plan, but DEO essentially said, hey, we've got this new law in effect. How are you going to potentially deal with this within your comprehensive plan? So this is a very recent example. February 2016, they submitted a letter back to DEO saying, okay, we're going to address that within our comprehensive plan. Their language is still pending approval, but essentially it parrots some of the language within the statute saying, marrying these concepts of FEMA and dealing with future flood risk in their comprehensive plan in the future. So this is a very recent example of language where they're dealing with sea level rise and consistency with 1094. Sunny Isles Beach, again, a very recent example, submitted their proposed comp plan amendment, which was complete as of February 2016. They specifically addressed the Senate Bill 1094 language. DEO has reviewed, sent a response letter back. It looks like their language is going to be fine in terms of consistency and compliance with the new requirements. We have, the DEO had, when they said we were going to amend their comprehensive plan, DEO did come back and say that they wanted to see the 1094 requirements. So this was the comment letter. We're still getting objections, recommendations, and comments reports from DEO where they're saying, hey, raise these new requirements, and then the city responded with actual language, new language. So this is another very recent example. North Miami, also in the process, submitted their proposed amendment as of October. DEO sent a response letter back, cited an objection saying we need to see the Senate Bill 1094 language, and the city responded and said we are going to go ahead and develop that language and submit it back to you. So that language is pending with DEO right now as they have submitted their final proposed language to DEO, specifically responding to their objections in DEO's comments report. So it was a very recent approval, also June 23rd. And the reason I'm running through these case studies is so that you all, as potentially local governments and practitioners, have examples that you can look at when your policy elected officials say, hey, it's time to start dealing with this stuff. You can say, oh, it's not so scary. Other local governments are actually complying with this stuff now, and that you have actual examples. St. Pete is another one. The interesting part with St. Pete was a lot of what they did was rely on their freeboard ordinance that they had recently adopted, a two-foot freeboard ordinance, and they noted that they were staffing up to deal with these issues and had put that language within their comprehensive plan. So, indicating that you are going to be dealing with these issues in the future and that it's going to become a normal course of business with your local government is a way to deal with compliance also, which was approved. I'm about to wind up. I have like 3 more slides. And one of the questions is, what would we do differently? I've talked about minimal, kind of the side of minimal compliance, but what would maximum compliance look like? What would be the types of issues that we would actually start integrating into our comprehensive plans? One is road design, to deal with future flood risk and incorporating new road design standards within our land development regulations, within our permitting and regulatory processes, and starting to say, hey, we've identified vulnerable road spots. How are we going to deal with them in the future? Another issue would be incorporating stronger or incentivizing stronger building construction standards. We've all heard of LEED. There is another program out there called the Fortified Hope program, which deals more with flood mitigation, resiliency, and having some level of certification also tied to wind resistance. So potentially incentivizing some of those stronger building and construction programs. Encouraging and enhancing buffering and natural shoreline protection within our land development regulations, or including that as a goal, objective, or policy within our comprehensive plans. Discouraging hard solutions that potentially have unintended consequences downshore or in the longer term. And then finally, the one that I talk about a lot is we have regulations from the Corps. We have regulations from water management districts, and a lot of those regulations have not been updated to deal with these new concepts, that we may not be able to have the same stormwater features in road design where we have constrained space or we have natural systems that we have to protect. So how do we have a creative win-win design solution that doesn't pit environmental or water quality controls against flood mitigation risk? And that is what I think is a big issue that we need to start looking at across agencies. But those would be the types of things that you might explore within your policies. And what does this mean moving forward? We don't have a lot of great case studies yet. I kind of moved through some of those quickly, and you can follow up and find out what that language actually is. I see bookends with these examples so far. Some level of what I would say, this is on our radar screen and we want to deal with it, versus actually almost like parroting the legislation and kind of going pretty far within comprehensive plan elements. DEO, their process for review and compliance is evolving also, which the survey, again, that Nancy just handed out is helpful with that compliance process, so that they are reviewing with some level of consistency the local governments that are submitting these new amendments in language. It's on a case-by-case basis. I think DEO has an idea of what they are looking for at this point, but they don't want to prohibit or exclude. What we're seeing also is that this is somewhat of a negotiated process, where if they don't feel that you've really hit the intent of the law, they're going to let you know in an objection, a recommendation, or a comment, give you another bite at the apple, and really try to work with local governments in terms of getting them in compliance with the new statute. And, this is what we're trying to prevent. A lot of us are planners in the room. We work with comprehensive plans on a routine basis. So what I advise local governments is that you do have bookends with Senate Bill 1094 compliance. But, from a policy perspective, it's not always, how do I minimally comply? Sometimes it's, how do I optimally comply so that I prevent these types of policy decisions in the future? And that is my presentation. Thank you.